to kind of go back to we'll kind of start back with the book a little bit, just because you have this term here, humanitarianism. And I want to ask you, how should we think about that term, humanitarianism, for the domestic context?
I mean, humanitarianism, the way it is generally construed, comes from French humanité, and the whole idea has its roots in the era of enlightenment, not entitlement, enlightenment. Yes, and it reflects kind of the liberal thinking about the primacy of individual, that all individuals are equal in their rights, that those rights are inherent in them by virtue of being individuals, and when individuals suffer due to crises, disasters, could be bad governance or whatnot, there is almost like a responsibility on behalf of the rest of the humanity to step in and to assist. So that same understanding would apply domestically. Humanitarianism domestically is that, well, yes, if there are crises, disasters, or loss of some kind that is not due to something that a rational, reasonable individual could have prevented, then there is a responsibility to assist those people in need. Unless you want to add?
Well, so are you talking on the institutional level in terms of like the need for an institution to take care of those who are suffering because of some sort of disaster? Is that how you're framing that?
I think humanitarianism as an idea is empty as far as institutional context is concerned. This is where domestically this question is, then who takes on this responsibility? Is it going to be the community? Is it going to be the state? Is it going to be someone else?
Well, and generally within research on disasters, and this applies to COVID too in a little bit of a different way, it is the community who takes on that responsibility. And they very much step up and do what they're supposed to do in terms of goodwill towards others. And that's directly in challenge to how we conceptualize disasters and crisis domestically and how people respond. I think there's a huge misunderstanding of what we actually do and what that looks like in practice.
Yeah, and historically too, even in the context of the United States, before humanitarianism was institutionalized, it was all community-based voluntarism. And to this day, the United States relies considerably on the infrastructure of charity groups, community organizations, grassroots organizations.
It's a little complicated because they don't want to admit that that's what they have to rely on, because really institutional, and we see this with COVID, like it was a bit of a disaster in itself in the way that we responded to COVID here domestically, although that's not a surprise given the kind of governance system we live in and how we view the role of public health and everything like that. But government in itself perceives of the role of the citizen in response as threatening in the ways that it's positioned within institutions of emergency management and everything like that, even though it actually does rely on citizens to do the work of responding. This is not to suggest that people involved in emergencies professionally don't do their job. It's just that if you're talking about a big disaster, a big crisis, they're very limited in what they can actually do because they're only so many and they only have so many resources. So, I mean, this is a really complicated issue.
Yeah. And Natalie, if I could press you a little bit on that for two things. One, an example, and then two, how policymakers can think about how communities will respond, people will respond in the event of a crisis, to help complement what communities will do with federal action.
There's a lot of examples so the examples you're asking for are those that come from the community in responding to disasters? Is that
right? Exactly.
Okay.
And then how to think about that in terms of like from a policymaker's perspective, because I mean this inevitably will be something you have to kind of confront.
We've had this knowledge for a long time. I just want to kind of like put that out there, that we've known about the capacity or the ways in which citizens respond in times of crisis for decades in terms of disaster research. This is well known. There's a disconnect between science communication and what people who are practitioners, including the government, understand about that. That's another issue. So one example of citizen response in a time of disasters, I can talk about two. One is during 9/11, which is typically thought of as a horrific event. It is a horrific event in which people were kind of like panicking and not knowing what to do. But there was, and I talk about this a lot in my teaching, the 9/11 boat lift. And not really a lot of people know about this because of the predominant narratives that are told about 9/11. This doesn't fit nicely in it. It doesn't resonate with this idea of terror. So basically Manhattan's an island and people were trapped there, and there were millions of people trapped in Manhattan, and so they all, not all, but a lot of people went to get off the island by boat or they went to the water's edge because all the roads were shut down and subways weren't working. And the only way off was essentially by boat. So commercial boaters started picking people up and then taking them off of Manhattan and then bringing them to New Jersey or whatever. And this started happening organically. And eventually the Coast Guard noticed what was going on and put out a call to other boaters. And this included like party boats, barges, commercial. I'm not a boat expert or whatever. So like if I mischaracterize that.
Lots of boats.
Lots of boats, tons of boats. Enough boats to take 500,000 people off the island of Manhattan in 9 hours. Yeah. Okay, so if you think about Dunkirk, that took a week and it was less people. This happened organically, totally unplanned. And so it was citizens coming together, working together to solve an immediate problem that was pretty much completely improvised, right? Yeah. That's one example. Yeah. Another example is, again, related to boats, but Hurricane Harvey in Houston, there was about 30,000 citizen rescues of people who were stranded because of the flooding that were conducted by civilians. Yeah. And this was completely unplanned, not organized. And I have a lot of stories about that because I actually did National Science Foundation funded research on Harvey, and I happened to be involved in some of those citizen-based efforts, along with a colleague of mine when I was at Sam Houston State University. And there's a lot of interesting examples about what that looked like in practice. But essentially, yes, that was like 30,000 people saved by ordinary citizens with boats. And I think one person died during that, and it wasn't related to rescues in general. So how does that happen? Yeah. That really, really is difficult to imagine when we place so much precedence on this idea of planning and government intervention. It directly challenges that. And there are a lot of other examples too. Yeah. So what do policymakers do? I don't think that policymakers really want to know my answer to that.
Why not?
Because again, it challenges this notion that the management of crises and disasters is solely an institutional endeavor and needs to be done by trained experts who are trained to respond, and that the citizenry in general is uneducated, uninformed, unprepared, and apathetic. And oftentimes the way that we talk about the citizens in these discourses is they're dangerous. And I think that we would, on the institutional level, have to come to terms with that and rethink how we approach things. And that's the conversation that, at least in my 10 plus years of doing this work, has been challenging.
Yeah. And what it sounds like you're talking about is a need to really understand the strategic situation. Because I think in some ways, where a policymaker or a strategist or someone who's on the hook to kind of make order or make sense of the lack of order may not be able to recognize what they're seeing could be actual order, but just something not.
It is order. Yeah. So I always argue in my work, and this is not just me coming up with this. This is built on a lot of sociological organizational theory, that human beings despise a lack of order. And so if there's a disruption to that order, we recreate a sense of it, even though it looks probably totally different than what happened before. It could, or just depending on how deep the disruption, it could look similar, but it's still slightly different. And the reason why is because, one, you're going to create order in a way that makes sense to the context, right? So if, for example, during 9/11, you think the building you're in is or the building you're close to is being bombed, you're not going to run into that building unless you're intending to save someone. It doesn't make sense. Like, if you're terrified, you're going to get the hell away from it, right? Mm-hmm. And so social order always exists, even in the situations that may look totally chaotic from the outside, and it depends on how the person's observing it. It's kind of like Schrodinger's cat, you know. Depending on how a person's observing a cat in a box, the cat may be dead or alive. It's the same thing with social order. You know, if you're coming in as a Marine and going to Haiti during the earthquake in 2010, it may look like total chaos and disruption, but the way that people are acting in that social context might make sense given their culture, given their experience, given what their social order looks like, right? And I would argue that there's no such thing as a lack of social order. Mm-hmm. We are deeply compelled to produce social order. Mm-hmm. It just might not be the order that the observer likes.
That's actually a really good point. So especially looking at natural disasters, so like a hurricane mm-hmm. or 9/11, for example, not a natural disaster as an attack, but looking at these types of disasters, but then looking at COVID, for example.
Well, it's a disaster. It looks different.
Type. So looking at COVID as a disaster, the perception that some people might have of control and safety is different than what the government might perceive, yes. and however you want to define the government right. might perceive of as safety. And then what some people might consider as safe is going to be a different mm-hmm. idea or perception that what other groups might think yes. is safe. So that is where you have the conflict occurring. Yeah. But when different people are going to have different ideas of what is safe and what they want to do in preparation for that safety, how does the government communicate? Is that where a lot more of the policing and seeing a lot more of policing with mandates or through mandates, through regulations?
I would say no. Policing can be a problem, and I think a perfect example is Hurricane Katrina. And that's because I wanted to talk a little bit about the role of media in this, right? Mm-hmm. Because it plays a huge role in how we understand what people do and how they behave. And media doesn't really push back on, the status quo as much as it probably should. In fact, it reinforces the status quo. So there's a scholarship that talks about this too in media studies, communication studies. But during Katrina, there was a lot of media coverage on looting during that disaster. And it was hugely problematic because what was going on actually wasn't a lot of looting, but the media projected that perception because we have this idea that without government control, then people go bonkers, and that's kind of what was happening during Katrina, and it affected how we responded to that particular disaster. So it turned away from, there was rescues still going on. Like, I don't want to deny that, but it turned more into a authoritarian response intended to reestablish law and order by turning on citizens who were stranded there and were perceived as criminals, looters, marauding gangs of people. And that's deeply problematic. Mm-hmm. So these perceptions of human behavior and social order affect how we respond, even if they're not correct. So you're in some senses, especially with what's perpetuated in the media, you're turning the imaginary into reality. Mm-hmm. And you're creating policies that are reactionary and aren't really considering how people actually behave.
But I think the question was, and you're both kind of tackling it from different angles, is where there is a mismatch between mm-hmm. those organically yes. emergent order and yes. kind of that imposed, preconceived way of thinking about order. When there is a mm-hmm. mismatch, it also can create, fear, uncertainty, yes. lack of ability to control. And when all of this is happening and the government is seeking to reestablish order as it conceives it, and it sees, reluctance, or it perceives or fears that there will be citizens disobeying, so then the emergency declarations are put
the
in
role
place.
of the media, then
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
And this is where the securitization comes into play, which is the idea of when something that is not inherently threatening, whether it's migration, disease, or it discursively become framed into a security threat, and then that is used to justify using some extraordinary measures, usually involving the use of force, some kind of restrictions and limitations on freedoms, as a way of reestablishing that control and reestablishing that order as conceived by the state.
Absolutely.
Just to ask a question about where we're going with this, because I think there's a relationship between a decision-making culture and the influence of human empathy. What I'm thinking of is the need to solve crises as fast as possible. And this could be something that's, constituents are looking towards government, the very people you're saying may not be able to make sense of the actual reality on the ground in some cases as you provided. And at least from my perspective as a planner, strategist, those scenarios or those rooms where we're looking at a crisis, we're being asked to provide options so that people can make decisions as quickly as possible. So that's kind of what I'm thinking of, given the scenarios you provided and some complexity there.
I think it's really hard to make good decisions if you don't have good relationships with the people you're making decisions with. And another example coming from Katrina is the inability to make quick decisions because of the political the relationship issues that the political actors involved had with one another. So Ray Nagin not being very effective until he got on the air and lost his, I'm trying to avoid saying a bad word.
Loss is cool.
Loss is cool, thank you. And that directed attention, but there was a tense relationship between him and Kathleen Blanco, who was the governor at the time, and then Kathleen Blanco and George Bush. So the ability to make decisions as on the institutional level, it really is informed by how good your relationships are with the people involved. And if, it's really all about that. And breaking rules. So as a strategist and planner, you probably don't like to hear that, but disasters show time and time again that the inability of the government to respond is based on crappy relationships and bureaucracy. And so if you don't have that flexibility built in, an ability to get rid of some of the red tape and allow for rule bending, then it's not going to go so well. And I think we have a really hard time doing that in that institutional way of thinking. And so decision making has to be flexible, it has to be improvisational, it has to be more empathetic in terms of if you're dealing with someone you don't like, you're like, I see that you're human, you're struggling too, let's work on this together even though I hate you, right? Yeah. And that's what empathy in terms of decision making implies.
And I'm thinking to your point, just your last point, there's a paradigm that kind of holds us, in your point about not being able to bend. I think that's the problem.
Well, look at COVID, right? That's an example of one, because it's really hard to institute national public health law when you have states involved and you have localities and all the different ways in which rules are made and all that. Our system isn't set up for that sort of thing. Public health isn't set up for that sort of thing. And it requires bending, and it requires not getting into your ego and on the political level, those decision makers not getting into their ego and being like, I'm doing this stupid thing for whatever you think the stupid thing is for my own political gain, right? There's so much involved in this.
We talked about securitization earlier, and so I wanted to kind of, one of our final points here. How should we think about security and humanitarianism in the U.S. context?
You're ending with that question.
Well,
It's easy, right? So I'll just start and then,
Please.
because I think this is important. I think securitization requires fear, and it's very powerful. So if you don't have that fear, then it's really difficult to securitize something. And it requires using different frames to look at existential threats. But the prospect of an existential threat is rather convenient if you want to reinforce the security institutions in place.
Agree.
Well put.
So the role of humanitarianism in that, and we can talk about humanitarianism, we can talk about public health, right? Because public health is intended to reinforce the well-being of a citizenry. They're similar things. And then we're talking about human collective action, which is kind of like what happens in the absence of formal response. So how do you continue to securitize when you acknowledge the place of those things and the fact that we also cannot control uncertainty,
Right.
period,
Yeah.
which is what securitization intends to do.
Yeah, I do want to also footstomp the point that securitization is actually not as easy as it may sound. To securitize something, the governments have to come up with a very, very powerful messaging,
narrative.
the narrative that will resonate with people and back it up with the force that they will use to reinforce that narrative. And what we've seen in the context of the United States in particular, there have been a lot of resistance. I do securitization of responses to COVID-19 in other countries. And what I found that even in some authoritarian countries, where you would expect securitization of health policies in the context of COVID-19, they did not securitize them because they figured out that they would be sort of unable in the face of the public resistance that, for whom all of those calls appeals to isolation and mask wearing and staying away from public squares and whatnot. It just fell on deaf ears. So I think, and this is where I think the more you try to securitize something, and especially if you are unsuccessful in some of those efforts, this is when you kind of position more and more people against the state. You undermine trust in state institutions because it can be a very effective tool of policy. It can be, sometimes it may be necessary, like all of those emergency declarations and whatnot, but it does have the negative externalities of sorts, whereby if you fail or if you do too much, then you lose the trust of people in public institutions. And when it comes to COVID in particular, or a disaster, or a situation when there is a lack of scientific knowledge, or where is the underlying mistrust of science, this becomes even more complicated.
So there's two instances in which I think securitization was successful for the United States. The Cold War threat of communism, and by extension, nuclear annihilation, and 9/11. And those were very, very powerful ways in which we securitized a lot of aspects of just life in general. And so there's a really great book that I always assign in my classes too. It's called Theater of Operations by an anthropologist, Joseph Masco. And he basically talks about the use of emotion as embedded in those security systems, like particularly fear and anxiety, and sort of how we intentionally or not intentionally or both kind of re-articulated the Cold War threat of nuclear annihilation into the fear of terrorism. And now it's changed. Now what do we have? China, right? So there's ways in which it's successful, and I don't know that maybe COVID, I think the securitization of COVID was complicated, right? It wasn't as cut and dry because there were a lot of people who weren't convinced it was an existential threat. And then there were some who were deeply convinced that it was, right? And when you don't have that buy-in, then that's where securitization also can fail.
Do you feel, or at least are you seeing, that there's always a boogeyman at present? So Noam Chomsky, Edward Herman, they published a book, Manufacturing Consent. And in it, they talk about or several layers of media and how public consent is manufactured.
Yeah.
And one of those components is having that boogeyman.
Oh,
So
yeah.
like you were mentioning before, you had the Cold War. Then we end up having terrorism. Now China. Then the argument, we had COVID, China or COVID. Also looking at the environment as a crisis. So always having some sort of crisis and fear, and being able to dial up that fear or dial it lower, dial it higher is a way that public can be controlled more by certain institutions. Now,
Yeah.
these are some arguments that certainly are out there. There's a lot of critics against it. There's a lot of people that support it, but certainly something to be aware of.
Well, it's interesting that we have this idea that the public can be controlled. And again, I think that the compulsion for humans to produce a sense of social order goes against that, right? The perception that the government, at least in our context, so like I can't speak to other societal contexts,
Right.
at least the idea that the government is what institutes social order is terribly misleading. And we control ourselves just by virtue of that's what we do as humans. And so there's instances in which securitization doesn't really work well. Like it's that perception that it does. But most people are really scared of, what's going to happen in their day-to-day life. They're not, they may be afraid of some sort of external threat, but that's not as present as what they're actually dealing with on a day-to-day basis and what actually kills them on a day-to-day basis. And it's what kills us is cancer and heart disease and our own behaviors, right? And then for a period of time, COVID was part of that, but it's not so much anymore. But I think securitization fails because it's not what provides the control over a populace, at least in our context.
Any closing comments or takeaways that you would like to add?
I think that this is a fascinating. I spend most of my time thinking about these things. So it's fascinating to me, and I think there's a lot to talk about here. I don't know if you share that same.
Absolutely.
So it's hard to wrap it up, right? But I think that we don't give ourselves enough credit in terms of like the goodness of humanity, especially when you're working in a college of war. That's fundamental to keep in mind, and I think I always find that when I talk about the research I do, it becomes very controversial. Which is fine with me. It keeps me on my toes. It keeps me thinking about how to improve my research. But I think we need to start to really be mindful about how we talk about external threats and how powerful that is in terms of things that we do and put into policy, and how we don't necessarily need to do that, right? And just based on the things that we've found by researching ourselves that we don't have to do.
And we've already got your closing comments on your book and the first part of this discussion, but any other comments?
No, I
for
absolutely
the
agree
domestic
that I
context?
think I will just add that our discourse, the words they can become the words are very impactful in the sense that as we speak, we make sense of the world, we create the reality for us.
Right.
And even if like in this conversation, we're like, well, yeah, there are areas for, cooperating with China. Yes, but once we get wrapped up in this discourse of great power competition or whatnot, again, those words then become confining. They become the straitjacket through which we perceive, and that kind of limit opportunities to see past those constructs.
And it could also head us to a future that we don't necessarily want.
Right.
Well, thank you, Mariya. Thank you, Natalie. We'll be sure to put your book information in the show notes.
If you could just introduce the book that you had brought with you today.
Oh, sure, yes.
Okay.
I brought it because it's something that I'm using in a class that I teach on biosecurity and zombies. But it's about how basically this idea of immunity, the immune system has been securitized and used as a metaphor, like a warlike metaphor to, and it also used in very interesting ways during COVID-19. So I thought if listeners and watchers had a further interest in this area, that'd be a great book for them to check out.
Yes.
Thank you for sharing that.
For sure. Thank you so much. Mariya, Natalie, thank you so much again for this part 2 of the discussion on humanitarianism and securitization.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thanks.